I'm going to talk a bit about workplaces and ageing, and I'm drawing on some material that's been generated by the World Economic Forum that has a gender council, as they call it, on ageing societies, of which I'm a member. But one of the main thing, I suppose, if there's a takeaway from this talk, is what I put there. That in terms of social policy, we really have to move from a situation where we think about the sticks, how can we keep people at work because we're not going to pay them, to how can we attract people, older people, into the workplace. So from sticks to carrots, and hopefully that will become more clear as we go on. So what's the problem? Well, generally speaking, we talk about a demographic shift. Everybody knows about this, you hear it in the newspapers, the number of older folk are growing in proportion to the rest of the population. But the real challenge that faces us is one of cultural adaptation. I think that societies have faced the challenge of cultural adaptation in the past, from changing gender roles, from changing to moving towards a more multicultural society. And if you think of it in that way, then what we're facing around ageing is that we're moving from a situation of the traditional society, which is triangular shaped, so it's sort of shaped like that, lots of babies being born, dying off pretty quickly, leaving a few very old people at the top, or not too old people at the top often. So that sort of traditional agrarian shape of society to one which is much more like that, so it's much more like a column, and with each generation being roughly the same size. So if we think of it in that way, that we're just going to have equal numbers of people around, all right across the life course, it becomes a much more manageable thing to grasp. And I think we should avoid talking in terms of great tsunamis and various other Armageddons that is so often associated with this discussion. So people are definitely waking up to the issue of ageing societies. This is from Standard & Poor's, and points out the fiscal and social impact, that is the government spending and the social impact of ageing. No other force is likely to shape the future of national economic health, public finances and policy making as the irreversible rate at which the world's population is ageing. So when outfits like Standard & Poor's start talking about this, you know that it's a big ticket issue for the economists. And this helps us see why. This is where you can look here and see the change in population by age, and the bright blue line at the top is Japan, that, as we know, has been ageing and is in the sort of in the lead when it comes to ageing societies. And Ireland, England, the UK, Germany's slightly different, but mostly bumping along in the middle there. But then if you look at the red line and the purple line at the bottom, that's China and India, and they are ageing at a much faster rate than some of these other societies. And another way of thinking about that is that you can think about the speed at which this is happening. So actually in the advanced economies in the West, we've been sort of dealing with this issue for a while. If you look at that here, this is France. So, and this is the period of time in which the share of people over 60 increased from 7 to 14% of the population. So that happened over a period of almost 200 years for the French. But when you look at countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, it's in a much shorter period, 20-year period, I think, rather than a 200-year period. So that shows you the speed at which cultural change is happening around ageing, and how actually in the West we've got a relatively easy time of it relative to other parts of the world. Ageing is not an advanced or a mature economy issue anymore. It's a global issue. So, and that change translates into this dreaded demographic ratio. And that is effectively the number of people of working age compared to the number of people who aren't of working age. So children and people who have retired. And as you can see there, this is the number of people 15 to 64 years old per person 65 plus. And if you go from 2000 to 2050, you can see the speed at which some of those countries, like India is that blue one at the top there, who's really doing a nosedive in terms of the proportion of the working age population in comparison to some of the ones at the bottom, Finland, Germany, New Zealand, UK, US and so on. So that's the real problem. That's what's worrying the economists. They're saying, well, hang on a minute, there aren't going to be enough people working to pay the taxes, to pay for the services for the other folk. And of course, this isn't just an issue of, this is another way of saying the same thing. This is by United Nations region. As you can see there, Europe has the largest increase in old age dependency ratios, closely followed by the States. And that's the thing, there's the triangle, there's the column. And most politicians are afraid that we'll end up with that misshaped trapezium, which is unstable and will fall over, and civilization as we know it will disappear. So that has produced this rethinking of what do we think about work and age. We know about the shrinking demographic middle, that is, people are spending more time in education, and up until quite recently we were retiring increasingly early, and that's why we have the shrinking middle of the life course, the shrinking middle of those of us who are at work. We know that there are more older and fewer younger people around to do the work, and in actuarial speak, they have developed this idea of the longevity gap. This is that the money that people may have saved, or nation states have saved, to pay for those years in retirement isn't enough for the length of time that people are living. So there's a gap between when the money runs out, and this is particularly a problem if you're using private pension schemes, and when you pop your clogs. And that seems you're a social problem, therefore, so die relatively quickly and save everybody the problem. The OECD in 2006 began to address this problem, and the answer that they came to, i.e. phase one of the cultural solution to the demographic issue, was summed up in the title there, Live Longer, Work Longer. They looked at 21 nation states were members of the OECD in these three broad areas: strengthening financial incentives to carry on working, tackling employment barriers, and improving the employability of older workers. But really, in terms of cultural terms, this gift of a long life that we're being given, we're being encouraged to fill it with more of the same. So we're being told, well, we've got these extra years, so let's fill them up with what we know already, which is work. And that is, of course, reflected in the one relatively easy mechanism that we have for dealing with this, which is changing the statutory retirement age. Now, that isn't the same as when people retire. That's when the state pays for you to retire. So if you're Rupert Murdoch, you could retire today if you wanted. He doesn't seem to want to, much to the chagrin of the rest of his family. But if you're rich, you can retire relatively when you like. But for most people, they're in part dependent nowadays on state pensions. And you can see there that there has been this trend recently. The figure on the left, as I'm looking at it, the lower figure is women, the higher figure is generally men. You can see that and most countries are having a graduated increase so that they sneak up on you with this, and they hope you won't notice. And you think, well, I might be run over by a bus by then. But they're creeping up all over the world. Most of the Scandinavian nations are 68, UK is 68. I think here we're heading for, well, it was announced the other day 66, but I think we're probably heading for 68. In Australia, they've just announced that they want to increase it to 70 as the retirement age, which is really the wild outlier on the scale here. And sometimes one wonders whether these politicians ever actually met an older person. And this is the gradual increase strategy. So, for example, in the UK, retirement age for women is to be increased gradually and equalised, which has already happened, to the retirement age for men. And later, it says in 2018 there, but we've had pretty much an equalisation process going on for some time. I think that's when people draw their pension. And then both sexes going up until it reaches 68. So it's a slow incremental process rather than a sort of shock horror. Suddenly we're all going to have to work longer and not retire. And the reason for that is this virtuous circle. If you have fewer pensions and more workers, the workers pay tax. You can use the tax to pay for pensions or other things that you want governments to do. So there's a virtuous economic circle. But how far does it address the purpose of a long life? Is the purpose of a long life simply to work longer? And what about the quality of those jobs? So this stick bit, you can increase pension eligibility, but it depends on a number of things, which are often not really looked at very hard. One is, are the jobs available? Are they decent jobs? Are they good quality jobs? Or are they casualised labour? Is there going to be generational competition between age groups? I'll come on to that in a minute, but it's certainly in the press you often see reference to generational competition for work. It also has effects on things like family transfers. People generally want to give down the family tree. You want to give to your, if you go and visit your gran, she'll probably try and slip you a euro, whether you need it or not. And we all do that. We all try and give money to our children to give them a good start, and so on and so forth. But if people are insecure about when they'll have a pension, there's no guarantee that mechanism will continue as strongly as it is at the moment. Also, in terms of housing, it can have a negative effect on the housing market because people, in the absence of a secure pension at the age they want it, they hang on to their house, they support policies which increase the cost of housing because it's good for you if you've got the investment. It's not so good if you haven't and you're a young family and you can't find affordable housing. And finally, it's a sort of moral economy. It's saying to be a good citizenship, you have to be in work. There aren't other ways of being a good citizen, and this one trumps the rest. So there are a number of issues which we could explore around the stick philosophy of dealing with working life. Now in Australia, they've had a lot of work around the access route. So they said, well, really, there we are, there's Australia growing and growing. So the top one there, this one is 2051, that's the year 2000, this is what it was like in 1961 and 1911. So you can see the sort of growth. It's pretty typical, actually, of most Western societies. But what we do have in Australia is quite an unusual mechanism called the Intergenerational Report, which is generated by the Treasury, and it happens about every 4 years. And there's a particular sort of offshoot of the Treasury called the Productivity Commission, which tries to, it basically takes Australia PLC and says, what are the threats and opportunities for Australia in 40 years. So it tries to put a 40-year forecast on where Australia should be going, and it looks at things like climate change, migration, and in with the mix it looks at population ageing. In 2010, they specifically highlighted the question and the problem of population ageing. So it would put pressure on economic growth, and that drives rising living standards, substantial fiscal pressure, increasing demand for government services and rising health costs. So a very common narrative nowadays, and if you think that things like the OECD, the World Bank and that are a long way away from what your government will do locally, that's not so. It just takes time, and it appears in regional reports like European region, East Asia region, Oceania region, and then it filters down into national policy. Before you know what's happened, it takes a little longer, but these things begin to be implemented, and that's what we're seeing happening at the moment. Now, the Intergenerational Report claims a direct effect on policy, on co-payments for medicines, so i.e. sharing the risk, privatising the risk for payment of medicines. They have put in a number of measures to try and increase work participation, and also change superannuation to make it. It's actually a requirement in Australia to take out private superannuation, although that is shared with the employer, but it's not a choice. Everybody does it. And that came in about 1996. Or is it 1993? Anyway, it's still working its way through, so there are still people in the system who haven't had the benefit of collecting those schemes. This again is the Australian version of the creep up slowly version. So you can see there that when you qualify for a state pension, the age is going up and up. But what the real approach that has been characteristic of Australia, however, isn't that sort of fiscal mechanism so much as attempting to address ageism in the workplace. They have an Age Discrimination Act, which was brought in 2004, aimed at prohibiting direct and indirect discrimination against people because of their age. Now, whereas I say in the UK this has largely been aimed at health and welfare services, in Australia it's been largely aimed at workplace. And this is a historical phenomenon because in the interwar period and just after the war, they used to refer to Australia as the workers' paradise because it had this notion of everybody has a right to work, which of course was an old trade union call. And so most of the benefits are associated with being in work. It doesn't have it's never had a developed welfare state like many Western countries. So this is an attempt to affect access effectively. You could call it the access strategy. This is the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission statement, talking about Australians being locked out of the workforce by age discrimination and a waste of human capital. This is the dominant view in Australia, and there's been a series of papers from the Human Rights Commission addressing this question. This is about working past our 60s, it's called, about extending working life. This is about confronting stereotypes at work. And more recently, well, now actually roughly the same time, in 2013, there was a sort of a review of Commonwealth law to see whether it was discriminatory on the basis of age. So this outfit called the Australian Law Reform Commission looked at all legal statutes and said, well, is this ageist? And if so, should we change it? Which was quite innovative in its way. There's been a change of government now, so we're not quite sure whether this will ever see the light of day, but at least it's been identified as a question. So that's the basic strategy. It has to be said, it hasn't had a huge effect on employers, but it's all around work, access, and so on. This is, I had a dubious, I was actually an advisor to the advisory committee, would you believe, on this one, called the Realising the Economic Potential of Senior Australians. But in actual fact, when you look at the document, it isn't really about that. It's attempting to put an alternative point of view about the value of older citizens rather than simply the economic. And it really relies on this sort of thinking, that we invest a lot in older people across the life course, so why aren't we drawing on that investment? So it's using the banking language to say, you know, there's potential in older people. So continuing learning, adaptation such as the age-friendly cities, redesigning the built environment to make it possible for people to engage with society. And that in itself, and in collaboration with civil society and groups in society, should generate social innovation and therefore release that social capital and get a different sort of virtuous circle going. So that's the sort of thinking behind that, what we call the EPSA report. There are 3 of those. You can find them online if you go to the Treasury website. And they do put out a more holistic view than the OECD view, which is live longer, work longer. So generally speaking, more people are working, but there are these large country differences, and Ireland is actually between those two. There you go. There. So slap bang in the middle, really, in older worker participation. This is the OECD average, and this is the European Union average. Australia is actually not doing too badly. It's up here in terms of older worker participation. So on. But is that enough? And I think this is the question we have to ask. Is it enough to remove benefits effectively so that people have to work, plus address access issues so that people can't be discriminated against when they apply for jobs? And I think this is where the World Economic Forum comes in. It has tried to address this issue. This is from a recent document which is called Global Principles for Age-Friendly Businesses. It says global companies of the future will likely look very different from those of today. First, as a consequence of gains in longevity, and second is because of declining birth rates. And this is affecting, as we've seen, all different countries in the world, except actually for the Russian Federation and parts of Africa. Russian Federation went into reverse recently. It's just coming out of it again. In terms of longevity, that is. And if we don't all die of obesity, then we can expect longevity to continue. So the point here is that older workers may well become a necessity for companies in the future, and we will see a global market in skilled older workers, just as we do in other working groups, which requires some sort of cultural shift. Age-friendly work, then, may be the next step. We've looked at the stick, we've looked at the access route. Now maybe it's the time to begin to look at what is actually happening in the workplace, and can we make it attractive? Can we attract older workers or retain older workers? This is from the WEF again. Design jobs that create a quality person-job fit that accounts for changes across the life course. and provide complex and mentally challenging work for mature workers to increase satisfaction and well-being. And it really depends, this argument within the Ageing Societies group at the forum depends on two things, I think, when you step back from it. One is the notion of not a longevity deficit, but a longevity dividend. And this relies on the notion that if we've got much longer life and we've got healthier older people, that's the important thing, then we can actually solve a lot of these fiscal problems. So it says, this is from a paper by the late Rob Butler and Jay Olshansky, who's not the late, he's not still alive, he's still with us. Jay and Rob here are saying that the extension of healthy life creates wealth for individuals and for nations. And if we succeed in slowing ageing by 7 years, they talk in this slowing age, I think they're talking about functional age, the age-specific risk of death throughout in disability will be reduced by approximately half at every age. Social, economic and health bonuses for both individuals and entire populations is a dividend that would begin with generations currently alive and continuing. So, in a way, this is quite a 19th century idea that you need healthy people, and then you have a thriving economic situation. But it is a very good argument for preventive health care and for supportive, age-friendly environments. What they do is they actually flip evidently they've got economic evidence for this now. So they flip the old argument on its head. We often think that, if we've got a prosperous society, then you get a lot of old people. What they're saying is, if you've got a society with a lot of old people, you have a more productive society. Which ideologically, at least, is a useful argument for us to have with the stick people. So here are some of the advantages of longevity as they see it. Healthy older people remain productive longer. They have more discretionary funds for consumption, so the wheels of capitalism turn, because you don't just need people to work, you need people to buy stuff. And if the older population or the ageing population has disposable income at their disposal, then it helps consumption as well as production. Healthy individuals accumulate more savings, they're less ill, and they also require fewer services thereby. So this is the link between health and economics which is being pursued. The second element to this, and I said that there is this fear about if we keep the oldies in work, or we give jobs to mature age workers, we're taking them away from the young unemployed. You see this quite often. There's absolutely no evidence for that. In economist land, this is called the lump of labour fallacy. The lump of labour fallacy says that there's a zero-sum number of jobs in an economy, and if you give it to one person, you can't give it to another person. There's been a review of this, a series of reviews, the best one using data from the census from the United States from 1977 to 2011, so it covers the GFC, in other words, the global financial crisis, and they found no relationship between jobs for younger and older workers. When they looked at gender, they looked at wages, they looked at education. None of these things were influence younger and older workers, i.e. competition between the two. And they say, this is by Manel and Yuanyuan Wu, an exhaustive research found no evidence of support for this theory in the United States. In fact, the evidence suggests that greater employment of older persons leads to better outcomes for the young, reduced unemployment, increased employment and a higher wage. So what they're saying is, if you've got a society that that employs mature age workers, that is also a society that has less youth unemployment. So there's not a relationship between the two. There's something else going along which is generating both. And that's an important argument if one is arguing that mature age workers should, for a few years at least, or if they desire to, be able to stay in the labour market. So what about these carrots then? So far we've just looked at a couple of arguments about this. Well, what would make a workplace more age-friendly? Well, there's quite a bit of research been going on in the past 10 years or so that can help us say what this might look like. Creating greater choice and flexibility about transitions in and out of work. So flexible working, more choice about when you work, when you don't work. Enhancing the capacity of older workers through access to training and anti-discrimination. Well, we've covered anti-discrimination. Access to training, it's changing, but it's still pretty awful. You don't necessarily get the same access if you're older. Even though older workers are more likely to stick around, they don't change employers so much as younger workers who often get trained and then use that training to move to a different job. Make the workplaces attractive. This is a Finnish research by Manninen at Tampere University, who showed that older Finnish workers, at least, would not necessarily want to stay at work or go back to work, but if they found the environment attractive, if they found people friendly towards them, if they found that the ergonomics of the place and so on were supportive of them as workers, then they would go back. But there's no guarantee that older people are necessarily going to go back into the workforce. And new pathways and meanings associated with work and retirement. Well, we've been living with that for some time, but if you're interested in recent research on this, Lisa Sargent and co. have done a special edition of Human Relations, the journal, which covers a number of options on, they call it rethinking retirement, on different models and different ways of thinking about the relationship between work and life in later life. So the World Economic Forum is arguing then for age-neutral workplaces. It's not saying that there's a zero-sum game. It is saying that if we have healthy workers, that's good for the whole life course. And it's saying that in the future, because we're moving from the triangle to the column, we need a culture that recognises the potential contribution of employees of all ages. And promoting an employment environment built on this age-neutral foundation. Another way of saying that you'll find in the literature is age diversity, age-diverse workforces. So the trick then is to work out how to do that. And I think we're only just beginning to move from this rather simple, in fact, access model to the rather more complex way of thinking about, well, how, for those who want to work, how can we create supportive and facilitative environments? These are the business principles. You can find them on the web. I won't go through them now, but effectively they cover like the built environment of the workplace, attitudes at the workplace, the opportunities for lifelong learning. They also say that workplaces should help people develop financial planning for longer working lives. Talks about healthy ageing in workplaces, so canteens with decent food, exercise facilities. You might think this is cloud cuckoo land, but in fact a number of large corporations in Germany, in Switzerland, in the United States are already doing this. They're already doing it. And they don't do these things because they're, charities. They do them because it makes some sort of business sense. And they're supportive caregiving. So in Australia, for example, you could get support for caregiving if you've got a child, but not for an older dependent. And that is changing, of course. It's changed in parts of Europe, and it will change everywhere. This is simply a list of some of these things: changing the design of the job, flexibility of working hours, opportunities for training and development, opportunities for health and the promotion of well-being at work and outside of work, rather than ergonomics, rather, not just the workplace design, but the actual design of the built environment through age-friendly initiatives, so that it's people can actually participate in society, engage with society, looking at different sorts of social connections with workers of different ages, and so on. Now, the best example of this, because you might think, oh well, this is all very well, but is it happening everywhere, anywhere, is BMW. There's an older worker. There's his car. Now, the BMW example is interesting, because if you were to say to people, you know, where are we going to employ, why should we employ older workers? They probably think that industrial production was one of the places where you wouldn't start to look. But strangely, BMW have done precisely that. They began to realise that they're not only getting more older workers applying to work with them, but they were having difficulty retaining the skilled older workforce they had. So they wanted to look at this. And as this says, they made 70 or so small changes to their workplace, things like wooden floor surfaces rather than steel floor surfaces, because they're good, they're better for joints, regular breaks, decent food, you know, nutritionally controlled foods available, a gym on the factory site, these sorts of things, bigger computer screens. And they found that it says here, this is from the Harvard Business Review, the project that cost them $50,000 improved productivity by 7% compared to other production lines. So it actually improved productivity from the average, and the defect rate dropped. So they're not, as I said, they weren't doing this because for charity, although they do claim it is a socially responsible thing to do. And they say it's no longer a project to aid the elderly, it's simply a fresh new plan to improve productivity. So this is the sort of world that we're moving into. In the States, there are places where you can either apply if you're a business, or you can recommend a business for prizes, such as, and they're pretty stringent. The AARP is, as you may know, is the premier voice on Capitol Hill for older people. It claims to have 20 million members, and if every member pays $1 membership fee, that's an awful lot of dollars every year, and they pay more than that. So this is a very powerful interest group on Capitol Hill. It offers services for older people, and now they're moving into the area of ensuring that employers and retail outlets are age-friendly. So they offer these rewards. You can become an age-friendly employer, and the way that they say that helps is that older consumers will discriminate between poor employers and good employers for older people. These are the criteria. If you want to be a good employer and get your gold star, they look at things like recruitment practices, opportunities for training, accommodations to the workplace, which means, you know, modifying the workplace, different work options, health and pension benefits, and so on, and follow up with people who've left the organisation. Another one that's recently been launched by the New York Academy of Medicine, very much the same thing, but focused on one particular city, called the Smart Employer Award. And you even get companies, like this is a German company, who are offering consultancy on how to create an age-diverse workforce that works. So they're saying companies who, in the 21st century, who are seeking to foster a working environment suited to changing needs of people as they age, have to consider issues such as staff development, training, how to organise the workforce, knowledge management and preventive health care. So very much a package for the progressive employer. And it has been argued that this creates a win-win. There's the World Economic Forum President Klaus Schwab talking about it. This is the World Health Organization. This is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, which is covers the United States and Australia and East Asia. They're all saying things that we have to adapt, we have to change now. It's a different situation. Older people have the right to choose the sort of work they want, and moving beyond the argument that the only answer for old age is work. And if it is the answer, this is, there's the United Nations as well. So they're all in there. The other thing I want to point out, and this is the final part of the talk, for those of you who are still awake, is, well, that's one way of doing it. We rethought the workplace, but it's a bigger argument, isn't it? It isn't just about a productivist approach to ageing. It's about, we've been given this gift of a long life. What does it mean? What should we be doing with it? Should we be doing more of the same, or are there other potentials that we can draw on for having a change in the shape of our population? And let's face it, we know what to do to save money, and we've known for a very long time. It's not, as they say, rocket science. Prevention rather than reactive intervention in healthcare. Reduce cumulative disadvantage, so combat poverty, that's a good thing. Because if you're poor and you grow up, you're not going to have a great old age. For a whole number of reasons about accumulating risks as you grow through the life course. Prevention in terms of health, poverty reduction measures. We know that people want to live in their communities for as long as possible. They don't want to go into residential care until they absolutely have to. Lot of change on that in the last 20 years, but still many more creative possibilities that we could be exploring. Working longer, yeah, I think that is part of the answer, but it's not the whole answer. And I think that's the argument to have with the OECD, that it is not the whole answer. It isn't just solving the fiscal problem, is not addressing the cultural shift. In fact, it's not creating any sort of change when you really think about it. Universal design, age-friendly adaptation to buildings, to increase social engagement, business innovation, new products, age-friendly products that are affordable, and avenues for civic engagement, so that older citizens have more of a say in their neighbourhoods and communities, of which there have been a number of experiments, not least in the UK. So that's what the life course looks at the moment like. We have a period in education, we then have a period in work, then we have a period of what's called here personal time. I think one of the things we have to address now as part of this cultural shift is, what do we mean by work-life balance across the life course? It isn't necessarily going to be like this anymore, and it might look a bit more like that. Yeah, there will be more personal time as we grow older, but also we need to rethink the way, and this is very difficult in policy terms. It's easy to say, it's difficult to implement, but rethink the way we use the relationship between work and life, personal time, education and work, so that we are continually reskilling people, so that we are and meaningful reskilling, not just getting a ticket, as they say in Australia, but actually things that actually help you. Trying to find a model which can address a shape where each generation is roughly the same size. So do you have a system where you can take time out of work knowing that you can go back and have that institutionalised and supporting of you, rather than it being a pressure and a drag on your career? So multiple forms of contribution, distinctive phases across a long life, where we have different life tasks as we grow up and grow old and we change. Age diversity in the workplace. We will see more international competition for older workers. It may not look like it now, but it's going to come. Changed recruitment and retention strategies by businesses. Preventive health and welfare strategies, and rethinking this balance. What do we want from a long life? I think is the baseline behind all of this stuff. So we need to move from sticks through access to the new thing, which is these attractive workplaces. And if you think of it historically, you can think of it as well, the first response when people woke up to the fact that population ageing was happening was to fill it with what we knew of already. So we just filled it with work all those extra years. That seemed to be the obvious policy response. I think the second phase, of course they overlap, these are idealisations, these phases, but the second phase is to increase access and reduce discrimination. And there's been partial, let's face it, partial success at that. But the next that we're entering now is to begin to adapt workplaces to become older worker friendly and work out what different age-specific contributions can be in an age-diverse workforce. So we're not pitting younger and older people against each other in the workforce. And then finally, and this is maybe the fourth stage, is what can we learn about the balance for the whole life course? So let's take this back, let's put it reflexively back on our whole experience of life and say, well, do we need to change the way that we're living now to make it actually a more pleasant place to live and work in? Now this is a cartoon, which is the sort of great fear, I think, if you have older workers. So send in the junior officer. Yes, sir. Hobble down to the canteen and get me my latte. They're saying that isn't the future. The future is much more like this, where you have an age-diverse workforce, where people have got complementary skills based on their age-specific capabilities, and I'll leave you with that.